Sign the papers and get out of my life. You were never anything more than furniture in this house, and furniture can be replaced." Julian Vance said those words to his wife of 11 years, then had security escort her out of their penthouse while his mistress waited in the bedroom. He didn't even watch her go. That night, Serafina Hayes walked into the rain with one suitcase and a silence so complete it frightened even the doorman who held the door. 3 years later, Julian would walk into the most powerful room in the world and find her waiting at the top of the stairs. If you've ever been told you were nothing, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel. Follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Julian Vance filed for divorce, he had his assistant send Serafina a single text message. Not a phone call, not a conversation. A text typed by someone else that read, "Mr. Vance's legal team will be in touch regarding asset division. Please vacate the primary residence by 5 o'clock. Serafina read that message while sitting at the kitchen counter of the penthouse she had decorated in the city she had helped him conquer, holding a coffee mug with both hands because she needed something solid to grip. She read it twice. Then she set her phone face down on the granite countertop, finished her coffee, and began to think. She did not cry. Not yet. That would come later in a hotel room 3 blocks away where she sat on the edge of a bed and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened to her life. But in that kitchen, in those first 60 seconds after reading those words, Serafina Hayes did something that would define everything that came after she decided not to break. Julian had not always been this man. She had to keep reminding herself of that, not to protect him, but to understand how thoroughly she had been erased from the story of her own sacrifice. 11 years ago, Julian Vance had been a brilliant but volatile tech entrepreneur with a company hemorrhaging cash and a reputation for burning bridges faster than he could build them. He was charismatic and ruthless and completely incapable of the kind of patient, sustained strategic thinking that separated companies that lasted from companies that collapsed. He knew it too, he just never admitted it to anyone except her. She had been working as a senior consultant at a communications firm when they met at an industry conference in San Francisco. He had been mid-argument with a journalist when she walked past, and he had stopped the argument long enough to follow her to the bar and say something so unexpectedly honest that she had nearly choked on her drink. He said, "I'm about 6 months away from public humiliation, and I don't know how to stop it." She had looked at him, this tall, sharp-jawed man, radiating confidence and concealed desperation in equal measure, and said, "Then you probably shouldn't be picking fights with journalists at networking events." He had laughed, a real laugh, not a performance, and she had been done for. They married 18 months later, and from the moment she moved into his world, she had poured everything she had into his survival. Not because she was weak, not because she didn't have her own ambitions, but because she had believed in something in him, in what they could build together, in the idea that a partnership built on complementary strength could create something extraordinary. She was the architect of Julian Vance's public image. She was the strategist behind his most important acquisitions. When his board of directors nearly ousted him in 2019 after a disastrous product launch, it was Serafina who spent 3 weeks quietly meeting with each board member, listening, recalibrating, and ultimately constructing the narrative that saved his position. Julian stood in that boardroom and delivered a speech that earned a standing ovation. He had written it with her sitting on the living room floor at 2 a.m, surrounded by legal pads and cold coffee. He received all the credit. She expected none of it. That had been their arrangement, unspoken, unwritten, and she had believed understood. She was wrong about that last part. Somewhere along the way, she couldn't pinpoint exactly when Julian had begun to mistake the output of their partnership for his own individual genius. He had started to believe his own press releases, and then Isabella Brooks had appeared, 27 years old, impossibly photogenic, a lifestyle influencer with 4 million followers and no interest in quarterly earnings reports or crisis communication strategy. Isabella was everything Serafina was not performing to be. Loud, decorative, uncomplicated. She wanted Julian's money and his attention and his name in her social media captions. Julian at 46 had decided that was exactly what he deserved. The affair had lasted 8 months before Serafina confirmed it. She had known for 5 of those months, had watched the geographic pattern of his phone's location. Data had noticed the shift in his energy when he came home, or didn't. She had not confronted him immediately. She had instead begun quietly preparing. She had consulted her own attorney, not the firm Julian used, but a sharp, young litigator named Margot Chen, who worked out of a small office in Midtown and had a reputation for being devastatingly thorough. She had begun documenting. Not with anger, but with precision. Every contribution, every strategy, every deal that bore her fingerprints. Margot had called it building a foundation. Serafina had thought of it as telling the truth on paper before someone else got to tell a different version. When Julian finally told her he wanted a divorce sitting across from her at the dining room table they had bought together at an auction in Copenhagen, not looking at her face, she had already been ready for 3 months. She had said very little. He had said quite a lot. He had said she was comfortable, but not inspiring. He had said he needed someone who matched his energy. He had said, and this was the sentence she would return to many times in the years that followed, not with pain, but with a kind of cold, clarifying fury. Serafina, let's be honest with each other. You were never exactly the kind of woman men build monuments to. She had looked at him across that table and thought, you have absolutely no idea who I am. She had not said it. She had simply nodded and asked when his attorney would be contacting hers. The settlement had been deliberately insulting. Julian's legal team had come in aggressive, banking on the assumption that Serafina would be too emotionally devastated to fight effectively, that she would take what they offered just to make the pain stop. They offered a number that was essentially a severance package, a small Manhattan apartment, and a cash figure that acknowledged her existence without acknowledging her contribution. Margot had walked into that first negotiation meeting, set a binder on the table that was 4 inches thick and said, "We're going to need a larger room." What Margot had documented with Serafina's meticulous assistance was the complete operational architecture of Julian's success. Email threads, strategy documents, board correspondence, communications that bore Serafina's name, or in many cases her voice, even when her name wasn't on them. The case for her contribution to the company's value was not emotional. It was forensic. Julian's team had been expecting a grieving wife. They had not been expecting a co-founder. The final settlement was not public. Serafina had insisted on that not to protect Julian, but because she had no interest in a public battle. She had what she needed, enough capital to move enough legal protection to be free, and something Julian's team had never anticipated. She would claim a series of intellectual property rights over strategic frameworks she had developed, and that were woven into the DNA of Vance Technologies. Julian had not even understood what he was signing away. His lead attorney had understood, had pushed back hard for 2 days, and had ultimately lost the argument because Margot had built an airtight case, and they both knew it. Serafina had walked out of that final meeting and stood on a sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan on a gray October afternoon, and she had breathed for what felt like the first time in a year. Margot had stood beside her and said, "So, what now?" Serafina had looked up at the sky. "Now," she had said quietly, "I go to work." She had moved to Washington, D.C., not to hide, to rebuild. She had chosen D.C. deliberately. It was a city that understood the architecture of power in ways that New York, for all its financial muscle, sometimes didn't. New York worshipped capital. Washington understood influence. And influence, Serafina had come to believe, was the deeper currency. She had rented an apartment in Georgetown, walked the same streets every morning for 3 weeks, saying almost nothing to almost no one. And then she had made a phone call that she had been sitting on for 2 years. The person she called was a woman named Constance Fairfax, former Deputy Secretary of State, currently operating as a private strategic advisor to 3 governments and a handful of philanthropic organizations whose names most people wouldn't recognize, but whose decisions touched millions of lives. Serafina had met Constance briefly at a policy dinner in New York 4 years earlier and had spent 40 minutes in a corner conversation with her that had left her feeling, for the first time in a long time, like the most awake version of herself. Constance had handed her a card at the end of that evening and said with complete seriousness, "If you're ever ready to stop playing a supporting role, call me." Serafina had kept the card in the back of a drawer for 4 years. She called now. Constance picked up on the second ring. There was a pause after Serafina said her name, and then Constance said, "I wondered how long it would take." They met for breakfast 2 days later, and by the end of that meeting, the architecture of what would become the Phoenix Foundation had begun to take shape in both their minds. The Phoenix Foundation was not built quickly. That was the first thing Serafina had to accept, that real power was not assembled in weeks or months, that it required the kind of patient construction she had always been good at, but had never before applied entirely to herself. She spent the first year in Washington doing what she did best, listening, connecting, understanding the landscape. She attended events not as a tech CEO's wife, but as herself as a strategic thinker with a particular expertise in corporate communications, crisis management, and organizational architecture. She was 53 years old and had spent the previous decade and a half being invisible by choice, and she had discovered in that invisibility how much she had actually learned. The people she met in Washington were different from the people Julian moved among. They were quieter about their power. They understood that the most consequential decisions rarely happened in public, that the boardrooms that actually mattered were the ones where cameras were not allowed. She found herself welcomed into rooms she had not expected, invited into conversations that surprised her with their directness. She had a reputation she came to understand not as Julian's ex-wife, but as the strategist behind Vance Technologies' unlikely survival in 2019. The people who paid attention to the architecture of corporate power knew that story. They had just never had a name to attach to it before. By the end of her second year in D.C., Serafina had raised the initial capital for the Phoenix Foundation from 7 private donors, none of whom required public recognition, and all of whom understood exactly what they were funding, an organization dedicated to rebuilding individuals, communities, institutions that had been hollowed out by the particular kind of exploitation that wears a respectable face. The focus was corporate and emotional abuse. The kind of damage that doesn't always leave visible marks but dismantles people from the inside. The kind of damage she knew something about. She had also, in that second year, been introduced to Prince Alistair of Valoria through Constance's network. Valoria was a small European principality with outsized diplomatic reach and a royal family that had spent 3 generations cultivating exactly the kind of quiet, enduring influence that Serafina had spent 2 years studying. Alistair was 41, thoughtful, and possessed of the particular quality she had come to associate with people who had genuine authority. He never felt the need to announce it. He had attended one of the Phoenix Foundation's early private briefings at Constance's invitation, had asked 3 questions that went directly to the structural heart of what Serafina was building, and had offered his foundation's partnership before the meeting ended. Their alliance was professional, strategic, and built on genuine mutual respect. It was, Serafina sometimes thought, the first entirely honest partnership she had ever entered. The Grand Sapphire Gala had been Constance's idea, and it was a masterstroke. Washington held charity events the way New York held fashion weeks, constantly competitively, each one trying to outshine the last. But the Grand Sapphire was different from the moment its invitations went out. The invitations themselves were objects hand-delivered, elegantly minimal, bearing only the Phoenix insignia and a date. No sponsor logos, no corporate branding. The guest list was the statement: 43 heads of state, 22 sitting members of various royal families, and a curated selection of the most consequential private sector figures in the world. People who were invited did not ask what the event was for. They understood that the invitation itself was a signal that they had been assessed, evaluated, and found relevant. Declining was possible. No one declined. Julian Vance received his invitation 6 weeks before the event. It arrived at his New York office by private courier, and his assistant had placed it on his desk with a note that read simply, "Grand Sapphire Gala, Washington, D.C., formal black tie." Julian had picked it up, noted the Phoenix insignia, which he did not recognize, and felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came with being invited to rooms where not everyone was invited. He had handed it back to his assistant and said, "Block the date, and tell Isabella I need her in a Valentino." He had not asked who the host was. He had not thought to. He spent those 6 weeks at the height of what he believed was his peak. The Vance Technologies merger he had been engineering for 18 months was 48 hours from closing a deal that would make him, by most calculations, untouchable in the American tech sector. Isabella had been particularly attentive that week, filming content at their apartment, tagging him in stories that his publicist had coached her to frame as a power couple narrative. He had given 2 television interviews. He had appeared on the cover of a business magazine with a headline about disruption and vision. He felt standing in front of his bathroom mirror on the morning of the gala, like a man who had correctly ordered the universe around himself. He did not know, because he had not thought to investigate, that the Phoenix Foundation had quietly contacted 3 of the 7 major investors in his pending merger 6 weeks earlier. He did not know that those conversations had been substantive, careful, and devastatingly well-informed, informed by someone who understood the internal mechanics of Vance Technologies with an intimacy that could only come from years of proximity to its most sensitive decisions. He did not know that 2 of those investors had already made private decisions, and that a third was wavering in a direction that would become clear very soon. He did not know any of this because it had been handled in rooms he didn't know existed by a woman he had decided was no longer relevant to his story. Isabella had been radiant getting ready that evening, turning in front of the full-length mirror in their hotel suite in her red Valentino gown and saying, "Julian, tell me honestly, does this read as too much?" Julian had looked at her reflection and said, "It reads as exactly right." She had laughed, pleased, and returned to her makeup. He had straightened his bow tie, checked his phone. The merger team had sent a confirmation update, everything on track, and thought, tonight is going to be perfect. The convoy of black vehicles that carried them from the hotel to the Grand Federal Palace moved through Washington streets, still lit by the last of the evening light, and Julian Vance rode in the back of the lead car, feeling like a man arriving at his own coronation. What he felt stepping onto that red carpet with Isabella's hand in the crook of his arm was the particular pleasure of being watched. The cameras, the shouted questions. He gave them 30 seconds of eye contact, and a half smile that he had learned over years was more effective than a full one. Isabella was perfectly positioned. She knew how to angle herself for maximum visual impact, how to laugh at exactly the right moment, how to exist in a photograph in a way that made the man beside her look chosen. They were on the surface of things a very effective performance. Inside the Grand Federal Palace, he moved through the early part of the evening with the confidence of a man who expected to be recognized and was not disappointed. He shook hands with a senator. He exchanged cards with a European financier whose name he half recognized. He accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray and assessed the room with the practiced eye of someone who had learned in rooms like this to identify where the power was concentrated. He noticed the unusual absence of corporate branding, the unusual quiet of the crowd. These were not people who networked noisily. They spoke in close, low clusters. They did not distribute business cards. He found it faintly unsettling and compensated by laughing slightly too loudly at something a nearby acquaintance said. He made a comment to Isabella, low near her ear. The host must be old money. They've staged this like a museum. Isabella had glanced around and said, "I've been trying to figure out who it is. My publicist couldn't get a name." Julian had shrugged, unconcerned. "Probably some diplomat's widow with a cause." Isabella had nodded and reached for another glass of champagne. Neither of them thought further about it. The evening continued. The dinner was impeccably executed. The conversation at their table was polished and surface level, and Julian navigated it with ease, dropping the name of his pending merger twice without being obvious about it, watching for the reactions that confirmed his relevance. He was in the middle of a sentence talking to a man across the table whose foundation he vaguely recognized the name of when the lights changed. It was subtle at first, the room dimming by degrees rather than all at once, so that guests gradually stopped speaking and turned toward the grand staircase at the far end of the hall. The orchestra, which had been providing background accompaniment, resolved to silence on a single note and held it. Julian turned to, set his champagne down, and waited with the mild curiosity of a man expecting a speech. The announcer's voice was measured and precise. It carried across the room without a microphone in a way that made Julian aware the acoustics of the space had been designed for exactly this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice said, "the founder and chair of the Phoenix Foundation, the Duchess of Solara." There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to be deliberate, and then she appeared at the top of the staircase. The sapphire gown caught the light first. That was the first thing Julian registered, the shimmer of deep blue, as a figure emerged from the gallery above. He watched the way the room responded before he looked at her face, a collective stillness, a held breath, the quality of attention that a room gives to someone it has decided matters. She walked without hurry. She held herself with the particular composure of someone who had never needed to perform certainty because she actually possessed it. The phoenix insignia at her collar caught the light. She was walking down toward a room of presidents and royals, and they were watching her the way you watch someone you have already decided to take seriously. Julian watched all of this and felt something shift in his chest, not recognition, not yet just the first cold edge of something he couldn't name. And then she reached the midpoint of the staircase, and the light fell fully on her face, and Julian Vance stopped breathing. The glass in his hand dropped. It hit the edge of the table, tipped and shattered on the marble floor. He did not look down. He could not look away from the staircase. Isabella turned at the sound. "Julian, what?" And then followed his gaze and fell silent, because the look on his face was something she had never seen before. Not shock exactly, something past shock, something that looked, if you watched it long enough, like a man watching the architecture of everything he believed about himself begin to crack. Because the woman on that staircase, the woman the room full of presidents and princes had risen slightly to acknowledge, was Serafina Hayes, his ex-wife. The woman he had told with full sincerity that she would never be the kind of woman men built monuments to. She was walking into the center of the most powerful room in the world, and it had been built for her, around her, because of her, and she had not needed his name or his money or his permission to do a single part of it. Julian stood there with champagne on his shoe and glass on the floor, and the sound of the room's quiet, distinguished applause in his ears, and he understood for the very first time what he had thrown away. Not a wife, not a partner. The only person who had ever seen the full shape of what was possible and been willing to build it in silence beside him. She reached the bottom of the staircase. She greeted Prince Alistair, who stepped forward and spoke something quiet and warm near her ear, and she smiled, not a performance smile, but a real one, the kind Julian hadn't seen directed at him in years and hadn't understood until this moment he had lost. She turned to address the room. Her voice, when it came, was steady and unhurried, and exactly as composed as the rest of her. "Thank you all for being here," Serafina said. "The Phoenix Foundation exists because some things need to be rebuilt from the foundation up, and tonight we begin that work together." The room responded with the particular approval of people who recognize precision, not loud, not effusive, but genuine. Julian heard none of it clearly. He was standing 15 feet away from the woman he had erased from his story, watching her exist at the center of a world she had built without him, and the sound in his ears was the specific frequency of a man's certainty collapsing. Isabella touched his arm. "Julian," her voice was careful. "Who is she?" He didn't answer immediately. Couldn't. He was watching Serafina move through the room, presidents touching her elbow and greeting royalty, inclining their heads, diplomats angling toward her with the body language of people hoping for a moment of her time. She was not performing power. She was exercising it, which is a completely different thing, and he had once been close enough to the difference to understand it and had chosen not to pay attention. "Julian?" Isabella's voice was sharper now. "Who is that woman?" He turned to look at her, and something in his face made her step back slightly, not from fear, but from the instinct of someone who has just understood that the ground they are standing on has changed in a way they haven't fully mapped yet. "That," he said, and his voice came out quieter and flatter than he intended, "is my ex-wife." The silence that followed between them lasted 4 seconds. Then Isabella said, "She's the host." Not a question, a recalibration. The kind of recalibration that happens when the story you have been living in turns out to have had a different protagonist than you assumed. "Yes," Julian said. Isabella set her champagne down. She didn't say anything else immediately. She was doing arithmetic. Julian could see it, the social arithmetic of someone deciding very quickly what her proximity to this situation was costing her, and whether the cost was one she was willing to continue paying. He recognized the calculation because he had seen it on the faces of business partners assessing sinking investments. He had just never expected to be the investment in question. Across the room, Serafina had not looked at him, not once in all the time since she had descended that staircase. She had moved through the space with a completeness of attention to others that felt from where Julian stood less like avoidance and more like simple irrelevance. He did not exist in her field of focus because he was not a factor in her calculation. That understanding arrived in him slowly, and then all at once, the way a full understanding sometimes does. And when it landed with a weight he hadn't anticipated. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. A message from his chief financial officer, Marcus Reed, sent to the executive thread. Getting unusual signals from the Hartwell and Park side. Can someone check in on their status tonight? Julian stared at the message. Hartwell and Park were 2 of the 7 institutional investors committed to the merger. He typed back, "What kind of signals?" and waited. Marcus's reply came in 40 seconds. Went quiet this afternoon. Our contact there isn't returning calls. Julian's jaw tightened. He typed, "Find out why, tonight." He put his phone away and looked back toward the staircase. And for the first time that evening, Serafina looked at him. It was brief, a glance measured and neutral, the kind of look you give a piece of furniture you are deciding whether to move or simply work around. There was no anger in it, no satisfaction, no recognition of what his presence in this room was costing him, even as he stood there. There was simply nothing, which was, he was beginning to understand the most devastating thing she could have offered him, because nothing meant she had finished feeling anything about him a long time ago, and had spent the time since building a world where he was not a variable. She looked away. She was back in conversation before he had finished processing what her face had held. And Julian Vance stood in the center of the most important room he had ever been in and understood for the very first time that he had made an error he could not correct. Not the divorce, not the cruelty of it, though, that was its own accounting. The error was simpler and more total than that. He had looked at Serafina Hayes for 11 years and seen what she allowed him to see, and he had never once thought to look further. He had taken the foundation she built and called it his floor, and never looked down to see who had laid the stone. His phone buzzed again. Another message. This one from his attorney. "Julian, call me when you can. Some movement on the merger side that I need to brief you on." Julian read it again. The cold thing that had been growing in his chest since he saw Serafina on that staircase pressed outward a degree more, and he recognized it now not as shock, not as embarrassment, but as the specific fear of a man who has just understood that he is not in fact standing on solid ground at all. He had come to Washington to confirm his power. He stood now in the most powerful room in the world, surrounded by a world his ex-wife had built, and felt the foundation shift beneath him like something long cracked, finally beginning to give. The gala continued around him. The orchestra resumed, voices and laughter and the precise social music of the powerful at work. And Serafina Hayes moved through all of it, like someone who had known exactly where she was going long before she arrived, which was, Julian understood now, because she had. She always had. He had just never been paying close enough attention to see it. Julian's attorney called 3 times in the span of 20 minutes, and Julian let all 3 calls go to voicemail. He was not ready to hear what he suspected those calls contained. Not here. Not in this room with Serafina 20 feet away, accepting the quiet attention of people whose names moved markets and shaped policy, while he stood beside a woman in a red dress who was beginning to realize she had arrived at the wrong event on the wrong arm of the wrong man. He could feel Isabella's energy shifting beside him, that particular cooling that happens when someone is running the numbers and finding the outcome unfavorable. She had not touched his arm again since he told her who Serafina was. She had refilled her champagne glass twice. She was watching the room the way people watch rooms when they are trying to determine the fastest, socially acceptable route to the exit. Julian put his phone back in his pocket and straightened his jacket and decided to do the thing he had always done when a situation moved outside his control. He decided to impose himself on it. He took a step toward the center of the room, then another. His stride was deliberate, the walk of a man who has convinced himself that confidence is a form of protection. Around him the Gala continued its elegant motion, small clusters of conversation, the soft percussion of crystal, the low orchestral undercurrent that made everything feel, despite the weight of the people present, like a dream you couldn't quite grip. He moved through it until he was 12 feet from Serafina, who was in conversation with a silver-haired man in a European diplomatic sash, and then he stopped, because he didn't know what he intended to say. He had taken these steps on instinct, propelled by the residual momentum of a man who had spent years walking into rooms and expecting them to reorganize around his arrival. But Serafina did not reorganize. She continued her conversation, and she did not look up. And the European diplomat gave Julian the brief, courteous, entirely dismissive glance that powerful men give to people who enter their peripheral vision without introduction, and then looked back at her. Julian stood there for 4 seconds that felt like 4 minutes, then turned and walked back to where Isabella was standing. She watched him return with an expression he couldn't quite read, which was unusual. Isabella's face had always been an easy text for him. "That went well," she said. Her voice was flat. Julian reached for a glass from a passing tray and said nothing. Isabella looked at her phone, then back at him. "My publicist just texted me," she said. "She says this gala is the Phoenix Foundation's official launch event. She says the foundation has been tied to major investor relationships across the Atlantic corridor." She paused. "She also says the founder has been on the covers of 3 European financial publications in the last year." Another pause, shorter. "Did you know that—" Julian drank. "No," he said. Isabella looked at him for a long moment. "How well did you know her?" she asked. "When you were married." Julian set his glass down. "Well enough," he said. Isabella nodded slowly. "Right," she said, and the word carried in it a complete sentence that she had chosen with unusual restraint not to finish out loud. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Marcus, his CFO, and the message was 3 words: "Call me now." Julian read it, felt the cold thing in his chest tighten another degree, and typed back, "In a meeting, 5 minutes." Marcus replied in under 10 seconds, "It can't wait." Julian looked up from his phone. Serafina was now speaking with Prince Alistair, who had appeared at her shoulder with the ease of someone stepping into a space that had been held for him. The prince was perhaps 10 years younger than her, and the quality of attention he directed at her was not the attention of ceremony. It was the attention of genuine regard, the specific focus of someone who finds the person they are speaking with irreplaceably interesting. Julian watched them for 3 seconds and looked away. He stepped into a quieter corridor off the main hall and called Marcus. Marcus picked up immediately. "Tell me you're somewhere you can talk." Julian said, "I'm at the gala. What's happening?" There was a pause on Marcus's end that lasted long enough to be its own answer. Then Marcus said, "Hartwell and Park have both notified us of intent to withdraw from the merger." Julian's grip on the phone tightened. "That's not possible," he said. "We have signed letters of intent." "Letters of intent are not binding instruments," Marcus said, and his voice had the particular careful flatness of a man delivering news he knows will produce an unreasonable response. Their withdrawal triggers a clause in the Whitmore agreement that allows Whitmore to reconsider their position. Julian said, "Whitmore won't move. I spoke to David Whitmore myself 3 days ago." "David Whitmore's office called our legal team at 4 this afternoon," Marcus said. "They are formally requesting a pause on the transaction pending a review." The corridor was quiet around Julian. Somewhere in the main hall, the orchestra was playing something he didn't recognize, something slow and precise. He said, "What kind of review?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Julian, someone reached them, before we did. Someone who understood the internal structure of our deal at a level that isn't public information." Julian's jaw set hard. He said very slowly, "What did they say to them?" Marcus said, "We don't know exactly." But Hartwell's representative used a phrase in their withdrawal notice. They said they had concerns about the foundation of the transaction. The word foundation landed between them like something dropped. Julian stood in that corridor and heard it echo, and understood fully and finally that the merger he had been engineering for 18 months, the deal that was going to make him untouchable, was falling. And he understood, with a certainty that arrived not as a thought, but as a physical fact, who had reached those investors before him, who had known the internal structure of his deal with an intimacy that only years of proximity could provide, who had spent 3 years quietly building exactly the kind of influence that could dismantle him without ever raising her voice. He said, "Marcus, keep this inside the executive team tonight. Don't let it reach the press." Marcus said, "Julian." "Tonight," Julian said. "Not one word tonight." He hung up. He stood in the corridor for a moment and breathed. Then he straightened his jacket and walked back into the main hall, because walking away was the one thing he refused to do. Isabella was not where he had left her. He scanned the room and found her on the far side of the hall in conversation with a young journalist he half recognized from a tech media outlet, and the angle of her body and the quality of her laughter told him she was doing what Isabella did when she sensed a better situation nearby. She was repositioning. He registered this and filed it without giving it the emotional bandwidth it might have claimed an hour ago. There were larger things in motion now. He found a position near the wall where he could see Serafina clearly, and she could not easily ignore him if she chose to move through the room toward his side of it. He waited. Around him, the Gala moved with the kind of fluid, purposeful ease that only happens when every element of an event has been planned with absolute precision. Nothing improvised. Nothing left to ambient chance. He had produced events before. He knew what this level of execution required. He had not, until this evening, thought to wonder who had taught him to recognize it. She came toward his side of the room 20 minutes later. Not because she was coming for him, he understood that, but because the natural circulation of the event was carrying her in this direction. She was in conversation with a woman he didn't recognize, early 60s, impeccably dressed with the bearing of someone accustomed to shaping rooms from within them. They were speaking with the ease of close professional intimacy. Julian waited until Serafina was 10 feet away, then stepped forward. "Serafina," he said. Just her name. He said it the way you say someone's name when you need them to stop and acknowledge that you are real. She stopped. She looked at him. And the expression on her face was the thing that broke something in him. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even surprise. She looked at him with the mild, composed attention you give to something that requires brief acknowledgement before you return to what actually matters. She said, "Julian," not a greeting, a confirmation of his existence, nothing more. He felt it like a physical thing. The woman beside her glanced between them with the alert, careful neutrality of someone who has assessed a situation in under 3 seconds and decided to wait. Serafina said to her, "Give me just a moment, Constance." The woman, Constance, nodded and moved a few steps away with the grace of someone who knows exactly what they are and are not needed for. Julian stepped closer. He said quietly, "How long have you been planning this?" Serafina regarded him without hurry. "Planning what?" "Specifically." Julian's jaw tightened. "The foundation, the investors, all of it." Her expression did not change. "The foundation has been in development for 2 years," she said. "It's not a secret. It's been covered extensively in the European financial press." He said, "You know what I'm asking?" She held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "I do." She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, "You're welcome to read our public filings, Julian. They're comprehensive." He stepped closer. Not aggressive, he was aware of the room, aware that every person of consequence in the world was within eye-line aware that whatever happened in the next 30 seconds would happen in front of an audience whose opinion of him had professional weight. He said the merger, just those 2 words. She said nothing. He said, 3 investors. You reached them. She tilted her head slightly. "I've had many conversations with many people over the past 2 years, she said. "That's rather the nature of building an organization of this kind." He said, "They were committed, Serafina, signed." She said, "People update their commitments when they receive new information." Her voice was even and unhurried and completely, utterly calm. "What information?" he said. She looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite pity and not quite indifference, but lived in the territory between them. The truth, she said, about the foundation of the transaction. She used the word deliberately. He heard it. "You did this to destroy me," he said. The words came out quieter than he intended. She said, "No," simply flatly, without decoration. "Then what?" he said. She said, "I did what I've always done, Julian. I assessed a situation, understood its structure, and communicated accurate information to people who deserved to have it before making consequential decisions. That's not destruction. That's due diligence." He stared at her. She held his gaze without difficulty, without the strain of someone managing anger, without the deliberate blankness of someone suppressing feeling. She simply looked at him the way you look at a chapter of your life that you have already finished reading. He said, "You haven't changed." She almost smiled. "I've changed entirely," she said. "That's rather the point of the evening." Constance appeared at her shoulder. "Serafina the ambassador is ready for you." Serafina said, "Of course." She looked back at Julian. "Enjoy the rest of the evening," she said in the tone of someone who does not particularly care whether you do or don't. Then she turned and walked back into the room with Constance, and the two of them were in conversation before she had taken 5 steps, and Julian watched her go and felt the specific quality of being irrelevant to someone who had once chosen to build their world around you. He stood there for a moment. Then his phone buzzed. Another message from his attorney. "Julian, I need to speak with you tonight. The Whitmore situation has escalated." He read it and put his phone away and looked around the room at the room Serafina had built, at the people she had convened at the alliance she had assembled from the wreckage of what he had done to her, and thought for the first time with full clarity about the morning he had sent that text message. Not his message, his assistant's, not even the dignity of his own words. A severance notice dressed as a legal formality sent from a device he hadn't touched to a woman who had spent 11 years holding the architecture of his life together with both hands. He had called her furniture. He had said that to her face across a table in Copenhagen they had bought together, and she had looked at him with those eyes and said nothing, because she had already decided that the response she was going to give him would not come in words. It would come in the form of 3 years of work in a city he had dismissed. It would come in the form of a foundation that bore no trace of his name, but carried the full weight of everything she had learned beside him. It would come in the form of a sapphire gown on a staircase in Washington, D.C., and the face of a room full of presidents turning toward her like a room of sunflowers finding the light. Isabella appeared at his side. She had returned, though her energy had changed again, sharper, now pointed with a question she was trying to decide whether to ask. He preempted her. "I know," he said. She said, "What do you know?" He said, "That you're doing the math." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "She built all of this." Not quite a question. He said yes. Isabella said, "While she was married to you." He said no, after. Isabella absorbed that. "In 3 years," she said. Julian said, "Yes." Another silence. Isabella said, "Julian." He looked at her. "What did you do to her?" The question landed with a simplicity that hit harder than elaboration would have. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The fact of his silence was its own full response, and Isabella, who was many things but not unintelligent, heard it clearly. She took a small breath. "I'm going to find the ladies' room," she said. She walked away. He watched her go and understood that this departure was different in quality from all her other movements through the room that evening. This one had the weight of a decision in it. His phone rang. Marcus again. He answered it. "Tell me," he said. Marcus said Whitmore just formally suspended the transaction. In writing, time-stamped 40 minutes ago. Our counsel received it during the dinner. Julian closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "And the others?" Marcus said, "Hartwell is out. Park is out. We have Morrison and the 2 Pacific Basin funds remaining." Julian said, "Is that enough to hold the structure?" Marcus was quiet for a long second. "Technically," he said, "yes. Practically, the signal this sends to the market when it breaks tomorrow morning is going to require significant management." Julian said, "It's not breaking tomorrow morning." Marcus said, "Julian." His voice had the quality of a man who has just been asked to stop a tide with his hands. "I can hold the press until 10, Marcus said, After that, I cannot make guarantees." Julian said, "Hold it." Marcus said, "I'll do what I can." He hung up. Julian stood with the phone in his hand and looked across the room. Serafina was at the center of a small group. The ambassador Constance had mentioned Prince Alistair, and two others he didn't recognize. She was speaking, and the group was listening with the full-body attention of people who have decided that what they are hearing is worth their complete presence. She looked from where he stood, like someone who had arrived somewhere she always knew she was going. He looked at her and tried to find in himself the feeling that had carried him to the head of that divorce table, the cold certainty that she was replaceable, that she was comfortable but uninspiring, that her value had a ceiling he had already seen above. He looked for that feeling and could not locate it anywhere. It had evaporated sometime in the last 2 hours, dissolved by the evidence of this room and every person in it, and the woman who had built the whole architecture from nothing but her own intelligence and patience, and the particular fury of someone who has been told they are nothing and has quietly, methodically decided to prove the precise opposite. Across the room, he watched Prince Alistair lean slightly toward Serafina and say something. She laughed. It was the real laugh, the one he had heard at the beginning in San Francisco, the one he had been the cause of once and had stopped noticing somewhere along the way and had subsequently inexplicably stopped trying to earn. The sound of it reached him from across the room like something from a different version of his life. He turned away from it. He found a chair near the edge of the hall and sat down, which was not something Julian Vance typically did at events. He stood, he moved, he engaged. Sitting was concession. But his legs had made a decision that his ego had not caught up with yet, and he sat and he held his phone and he thought about the morning, 3 years ago, when his assistant had sent that text, and he had not considered it worth his own attention to deliver the message personally. He thought about the board meeting in 2019 and the speech he had delivered, and the standing ovation and the private certainty he had held in his chest that it had been his own thinking, his own instinct that had pulled the situation back from the edge. He had not been lying to himself exactly. He had simply been editing the story in real time, naturally, reflexively, the way you edit a story when you can't afford the cost of the full version. He had edited Serafina out of every chapter she had actually written, and he had told that edited version often enough that he had come to believe it completely. And she had known. She had watched him do it. She had said nothing because the response she was preparing was not verbal. It was this room, this evening, this staircase. His phone buzzed again, a news alert not from his team, from a financial wire service. The headline read, "Phoenix Foundation officially launches at Grand Sapphire Gala. Founder Serafina Hayes identified as key figure in Atlantic Investment Corridor realignment." Julian read it twice. Then he read the subheadline, "Former Vance Technologies Strategic Director emerges as major force in global capital restructuring." The phrase, "former Vance Technologies Strategic Director," sat in the middle of the headline like a correction being entered into the public record. Not ex-wife, not divorcee, Strategic Director. The title she had never been formally given, now given publicly in the financial press, in the context of a story that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with her. He set his phone face down on his knee and breathed through the understanding that the story of his marriage had just been rewritten in the public record, and the version that had been published was the true one. Not his version, hers. The one she had been building the documentation for since the morning his assistant had sent her a text message. He sat with that for a long time. The orchestra played, the room moved, the evening continued with total indifference to his presence in it. And somewhere across the hall in the room she had built, and the world she had claimed Serafina Hayes was at work, and the work by every visible measure was going exactly as she had planned. Isabella did not come back from the ladies' room. Julian waited 7 minutes before he understood that she wasn't going to. He knew because he had watched that particular walk before, on business partners leaving negotiations, on board members exiting rooms before a vote, on anyone who had made a private decision and needed physical distance to finalize it. Isabella had walked away with her shoulders set at a specific angle, and he had seen that angle before, and he had chosen not to name it when it happened because naming things makes them real. Now, 7 minutes had passed, and her champagne glass sat abandoned on a side table, and her small beaded clutch was no longer on the chair where she had left it, which meant she had come back for her things while he was looking at his phone, and she had done it without saying goodbye, because goodbye would have required a conversation she had already decided not to have. He picked up her abandoned champagne glass, set it back on a passing tray, and remained where he was. He was not going to chase her. He was not going to call her. What he was going to do was stand in this room and hold himself together long enough to understand the full shape of what was happening to him, because he had the sense, a cold cellular sense, the kind that bypasses rational thought entirely, that the night was not finished with him yet. His attorney called again. This time Julian answered. "David," he said. His attorney, David Park, no relation to the investor, said, "I need you to listen to me carefully and not react until I've finished." Julian said, "Go ahead." David said, "At 7:15 this evening, the Securities and Exchange Commission received a formal submission from an unnamed third party. The submission contains documentation related to the 2019 board intervention, Advanced Technologies." Julian said nothing. David continued, "The documentation is extensive. It includes internal communications, strategic memoranda, and a timeline of events that, Julian, if I have to be direct with you directly, contradicts the public narrative of how that situation was resolved." Julian said, "What kind of documentation?" David said, "The kind that was authored by someone who was in every room, someone with access to every decision." Julian closed his eyes for 3 seconds, opened them. He said, "Who filed it?" David said, "The submission is anonymous, but the SEC doesn't receive anonymous submissions of this quality without—" "I know who filed it," Julian said. David was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is there exposure here, Julian? I need to know what I'm working with." Julian said, "I'll call you in an hour." He hung up before David could respond. He stood very still. Around him, the Gala continued its composed, elegant motion, completely indifferent to the fact that his life was being restructured in real time. The music played. Someone nearby laughed at something. He understood, standing there with the phone in his hand, that the submission to the SEC was not an attack. It was documentation. It was the truth placed into the hands of the appropriate institution, by someone who had spent 3 years making sure the truth was bulletproof before she handed it anywhere. He understood this because he understood how she worked. He had watched her work for 11 years and had credited himself for the outcomes, and had never once considered that the person doing the architecture might one day decide to stop building for him. He moved, not toward the exit. He rejected that impulse with everything he had, but toward the bar where he ordered a scotch he didn't intend to drink, and used the act of ordering it as a reason to stand somewhere for a moment and think. The bartender set the glass in front of him. Julian looked at it. He thought about the board meeting in 2019. He thought about what had actually happened in that meeting, not the version he had told journalists, not the version his press team had crafted, but the version that lived in the emails and strategy documents and private correspondence that Serafina had spent 3 weeks producing, and that she had apparently spent 3 years keeping. He thought about what the SEC would do with accurate documentation of how a public company's board intervention had been managed. He thought about the word exposure in his attorney's voice and the specific register of controlled alarm that David Park had spent 20 years perfecting and had just, for the first time in Julian's experience, failed to fully conceal. The scotch stayed untouched. He turned from the bar and found himself face to face with Constance Fairfax. She had approached without announcement, which suggested she had done so deliberately, and she stood now with the composed, pleasant expression of someone making a social call while conducting something else entirely. She said, "Mr. Vance, I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Constance Fairfax." He looked at her. "I know who you are," he said. She smiled. "Of course you do. You're a man who does his research." The implication that he had not, in this case, done nearly enough of it sat in the sentence without being stated. He said, "You're the co-architect of the foundation." She said, "I'm a friend and colleague of Serafina's, yes, among other things." He said, "How long have you known her?" Constance considered the question with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. Long enough to know that what you saw when you were married to her was about 15% of what was actually there, she said. The rest she kept in reserve. I suspect you know that now. Julian said, "Is that a prepared line?" Constance laughed, a real one, brief and unperformed. "No," she said. "It's an observation, one that I imagine you're finding rather expensive at the moment." He looked at her steadily. "What does she want?" he said. Constance tilted her head. "In what sense?" He said, "Tonight, this. What is she trying to accomplish?" Constance regarded him for a moment with the evaluating patience of someone who has made careers out of reading people across tables. "She isn't trying to accomplish anything tonight," Constance said. "Tonight is the launch of an organization she built for 2 years. You are not a variable in that project, Mr. Vance. You're simply incidentally present." The phrase landed cleanly. Simply incidentally present. He had crashed the climax of her story by being on a guest list she hadn't bothered to cross-reference because he didn't factor. That was the full truth of it. He said, "The SEC filing." Constance's expression did not change. "I wouldn't know anything about that," she said pleasantly. He said, "Of course not." She smiled again. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," she said, and moved away with the specific ease of someone who has delivered exactly what they intended and needs nothing further from the conversation. Julian stood at the bar for another 60 seconds. Then he made a decision. He was going to find Serafina, and he was going to have a real conversation, not the exchange they'd had earlier, which she had controlled completely, but a genuine accounting. He was owed that much. He told himself he was owed that, and the telling had enough force that he believed it, which was perhaps the last time that evening that self-delusion would be available to him as a tool. He found her near the far side of the hall, momentarily alone, or as alone as anyone can be at an event like this, which meant she had 2 feet of space and no active conversation, and was looking at something on a small card she held, likely a table arrangement or an agenda note. He crossed the room toward her, and she looked up before he arrived, because she always had been aware of a room in ways he hadn't appreciated, and she watched him approach with an expression that settled into something patient and final. He stopped in front of her. He said, "I need you to tell me something honestly." She said, "I've always been honest with you, Julian. That was rather the problem." He said, "The SEC filing." She looked at him. "I'm not going to confirm or deny anything related to regulatory matters," she said. "That's not evasiveness. That's appropriate." He said, "It's everything, isn't it? Not just the merger, the 2019 board intervention, the Meridian acquisition, all of it." She held his gaze. "What I will tell you," she said carefully, "is that the truth has a way of finding the right surface eventually. I learned that from watching you rewrite it for 11 years. He said, "You could have done this during the divorce. You had everything you needed." She said, "Yes." He said, "Why didn't you—" She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone constructing an answer, the quiet of someone deciding how much of a true answer to give. Then she said, "Because I wasn't doing it for the divorce. I was doing it for something larger than you and me. There are people who were genuinely harmed by decisions made under narratives you constructed. Investors who made choices based on incomplete information. Employees whose careers were managed around a false story of how your company survived. They deserved the accurate version. I wasn't ready to give it to the right institution until I had built something strong enough that the giving of it couldn't be mistaken for personal grievance." He stared at her. "You waited 3 years to make sure it didn't look like revenge," he said. She said, "I waited 3 years to make sure it wasn't revenge. There's a difference." The distinction arrived in him with the force of something he hadn't braced for. Not revenge, accountability. Chosen and executed with the patience of someone who understood that the difference between the two was not just moral, but strategic. That revenge can be dismissed, that it can be characterized as bitterness, that it can be made to look like the act of a wounded person striking out from pain. Accountability, delivered through the right channels at the right time, with the right documentation, cannot be dismissed. It is simply the truth arriving where it belongs. He said, "Serafina." She waited. He said, "I'm sorry." The words came out differently than he expected. Smaller, quieter, without the rhetorical architecture he usually put around difficult admissions. Just the words themselves, stripped of everything that would have made them easier to say. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I know you are." She said it without warmth and without cruelty, and with the complete steadiness of someone who has spent a great deal of time arriving at a place where an apology neither heals nor reopens anything. "That doesn't change what's happening tonight," she said. He said, "I know." She said, "Good." She put the card she had been holding into a small pocket and straightened slightly. "Then we understand each other," she said. "I think you should call your attorney." He said, "I already have." She said, "Call him again." And there was something in the way she said it, not gloating, not warning exactly, but the matter-of-fact directness of someone who knows the shape of what's coming and sees no reason to obscure it, that made the cold thing in his chest press outward hard enough that he had to consciously hold his expression still. He said, "What else is there?" She looked at him, and the look was the most honest thing that had passed between them all evening, maybe in years. She said, "There's always more, Julian. You built a company on incomplete accounting. Tonight is when the rest of the ledger comes due." She turned. He said, "Serafina." She paused, but didn't turn back. He said, "Was any of it real, what we had?" The question came out before he had decided to ask it the way questions do when the careful management of self-presentation finally overloads. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned halfway and looked at him over her shoulder and said, "All of it was real. That's what made it worth being honest about." She walked away. He watched her go. Prince Alistair stepped into her path from the right, and they fell into conversation without breaking stride. And within 15 seconds, she was in the center of the room again, and the room was reorganizing around her the way rooms do around people who actually belong in them. And Julian was standing at the edge of it all, watching the reorganization happen and understanding that he had no part in it. He called David. David answered on the first ring. "Talk to me," Julian said. David said, "The SEC submission is authenticated. They've opened a preliminary inquiry." Julian said, "How preliminary?" David said, "Preliminary enough that nothing is public yet. Not preliminary enough that I'm comfortable with our position." Julian said, "What do we need to do?" David said, "Cooperate fully, immediately. Any attempt to manage the narrative before we understand the full scope of what they have is going to make things significantly worse." Julian said, "What do they have, David?" David took a breath. Based on the summary our contact provided, they have the 2019 board communications in full. They have the Meridian acquisition correspondence. They have what appears to be a complete strategic record of the period between 2016 and 2022, documented by someone with primary access to all internal processes. He paused. "Julian, someone gave them 6 years of the inside of your company." 6 years. Julian stood with that number and understood its full dimension, not a targeted strike at one vulnerability, a complete record, the kind of record that only one person could have assembled, because only one person had been in every room for all 6 of those years, had been in every meeting and on every call and at every dinner where the real decisions happened before they were dressed up for public consumption. 6 years. He said, "Can we contain it?" David said, "Not if it's what I think it is." Julian said, "What do you think it is?" David said, "I think it's everything, Julian. I think someone kept everything." Julian leaned against the wall, his legs again making a decision slightly ahead of his conscious reasoning. He said, "All right." David said, "All right." Julian said, "Start the cooperation process, whatever they need. Don't fight it." There was a pause. "That's yes," David said, and the relief in his voice was the involuntary relief of an attorney whose client has for once made the correct decision. "That's absolutely the right call." Julian said, "I know." He hung up. He stood against the wall and let himself feel for the first time that evening the full, unmediated weight of what was happening. Not the managed version. Not the version he would eventually tell a journalist or a board or a biographer. The actual version. He had built a company on a foundation that was not entirely his, and he had chosen, when that foundation asked to be acknowledged, to call it furniture and have it removed. And the foundation had walked out with 11 years of documentation in her head, and 3 years to decide what to do with it, and the patience and intelligence and strategic clarity to do it in a way that was unassailable. He had dismissed her, and she had built an empire. He had called her replaceable, and she had made herself irreplaceable to the most powerful people in the world. He had told her she was nothing without him, and she had used that as a starting line. Across the room, someone was laughing. He looked up. It was Serafina, that real laugh again. The one that had once been his, directed now at something Prince Alistair had said, and the prince was smiling the smile of a man who finds the person beside him genuinely, effortlessly delightful. Julian watched it and felt something move through him that was not quite jealousy and not quite grief, but lived somewhere in the overlap of the two. The specific feeling of watching someone be happy in a way that you are responsible for making possible, because you forced them to leave the place where they were diminishing, and the happiness they found on the other side is real and full and entirely independent of you. His phone buzzed. A news alert, not Financial Wire. This time a general news service, Grand Sapphire Gala Phoenix Foundation founder Serafina Hayes emerges as Washington's most consequential new power player. Baum Mam Shaky Sayin. Julian read the headline. Read it again. Then he read the first paragraph the reporter called her, brilliant, called the foundation's launch, the most significant philanthropic debut in Washington in a decade, called Prince Alistair's attendance a signal of European royal endorsement of her work. Her name was in the headline. His was nowhere in the article, not as context, not as history, not even as a footnote. She had been erased from his story so thoroughly, for so long, that the press had simply written the correction his name had never been part of her story to begin with. Or if it had, it no longer was. He put his phone in his pocket. He straightened his jacket. He looked around the room at the presidents and the royalty and the diplomats and the architects of global influence, and he understood that he was the least important person in it, not because he lacked power, but because the power he had was no longer the kind that this room ran on. This room ran on something he had spent 11 years living beside and had never learned to respect. It ran on integrity. On the slow, patient, unspectacular work of building things that actually lasted. On the willingness to tell the truth, even when the truth was expensive. On the kind of character that holds its shape under pressure because it was built from the inside out, not dressed up from the outside in. He had had access to all of that. He had slept beside it for 11 years. He had sat at the same table with it and eaten the same meals and breathed the same air, and he had chosen with full agency to call it ordinary, to call it replaceable, to send a text message drafted by someone else on a gray October morning and count it as sufficient accounting for everything she had given him. He stood in that room with that understanding sitting fully in his chest, and for once in his life, Julian Vance had absolutely nothing to say. The gala was winding toward its final hour when Julian's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer it. He was standing near the corridor where he had taken Marcus's call earlier, back against the wall, doing the thing he had been doing for the last 40 minutes, holding himself very still, while the world he thought he had built continued its quiet, systematic collapse around him. But something made him look at the number twice, and something in the unfamiliar area code triggered a recognition he couldn't place, and he answered it. The voice on the other end said, "Mr. Vance, my name is Richard Hollis. I'm a senior correspondent with the Financial Chronicle." Julian said, "How did you get this number?" Hollis said, "I've had it for 2 years. I've been waiting for the right story to use it on." Julian said, "Whatever you're calling about, you need to speak with my communications director." Hollis said, "I've already spoken with your communications director. She referred me to your attorney. Your attorney referred me to your CFO. Your CFO stopped answering 20 minutes ago." He paused. "Mr. Vance, I'm going to publish a story tomorrow morning. I wanted to give you the opportunity to respond before it goes to print. Julian said, "What story?" Hollis said, "The Phoenix Foundation's launch tonight has generated significant interest. In the course of our coverage, we've confirmed several things that we believe are of material public interest." He paused, the pause of a journalist who has learned to let silence do pressure's work. The first is that Serafina Hayes, formerly identified publicly only as your ex-wife, served as the primary strategic architect of Vance Technologies for a period of no less than 6 years. The second is that the 2019 board intervention, which was publicly attributed to your individual leadership, was in fact designed and executed by her. The third, Julian said, "Don't." Hollis said, "Mr. Vance." Julian said, "I said don't." There was a pause. Then Hollis said more quietly, "The third is that the SEC has opened a preliminary inquiry into financial disclosures made during the period in question. I'm not asking you to confirm the inquiry. I'm asking for your response to the attribution question." Julian said nothing for a long moment. The music from the main hall reached him through the corridor wall, muted and continuous. He thought about what David had said. Cooperate fully, don't fight it. He thought about Serafina's face when she said, "There's always more, Julian. Tonight is when the rest of the ledger comes due." He said, "You can quote me as saying that Serafina Hayes was an exceptional partner during our marriage and that her contributions to the company were significant." Hollis said, "Is that the full statement?" Julian said, "That's the statement." Hollis said, "Mr. Vance, I'll be direct with you. The documentation we've reviewed suggests that significant contributions substantially understates the situation. Would you like to revise?" Julian closed his eyes briefly. "No," he said. "That's my statement." Hollis said, "Thank you for your time." He hung up. Julian stood in the corridor and understood that the story was going to run regardless that his statement was going to sit beside Serafina's documented reality like a footnote next to a chapter, and that the distance between what he had said and what the record showed was going to be visible to every person who read it. He put the phone in his pocket and pressed the back of his head against the wall and breathed. Then he walked back into the main hall because the alternative was to disappear into that corridor and never come back out, and he was not, whatever else was true about him, a man who disappeared. The main hall had shifted in atmosphere since the dinner, smaller and feel more intimate, the structured formality of the early evening replaced by the looser, more revealing quality of a room at the end of a significant night. People stood in the close clusters of genuine conversation rather than social performance. He moved through it and felt for the first time completely invisible. Not the invisibility of someone who hasn't arrived, the invisibility of someone who has been assessed and found peripheral. It was a new sensation, and it had a specific texture like wearing a coat that used to fit. He passed 2 men he recognized from the tech sector, not his direct competitors, but adjacent figures whose orbits occasionally intersected with his, and they looked at him with the particular careful neutrality of people who have received information and are deciding what to do with it. One of them nodded, the other looked away. Neither spoke. He kept moving. Marcus called. Julian answered before the first ring finished. Marcus said, "Morrison just called me personally." Morrison was the 4th investor, the one who had, as of 2 hours ago, still been in the merger structure. Julian said, and Marcus said, "He's out." 3 words. The 2 remaining Pacific Basin funds had been silent since dinner. Julian said, "The structure is gone." Not a question. Marcus said, "The structure is gone." Julian said, "When does this become public?" Marcus said, "The withdrawal notifications are formal documents. Once they're filed, Julian, this is already public. It just hasn't been reported yet." He paused. "Hollis at the Financial Chronicle called our office 20 minutes ago." Julian said, "I spoke with him." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, "How bad is it?" Julian said, "It's accurate." Another silence longer. Marcus said, "I'll start working on the communications framework for tomorrow morning." Julian said, "Marcus." His CFO stopped. Julian said, "Make sure the communications framework is honest. Don't construct a narrative. Don't manage it. Just say what happened." Marcus was quiet for long enough that Julian thought the call had dropped. Then Marcus said, "That's not typically how we handle these situations." Julian said, "No, it isn't." He hung up. He stopped near the edge of the hall and looked toward the center of the room where Serafina was standing in conversation with three people he didn't recognize. Not European royalty, not diplomatic figures, but people whose bearing suggested a different kind of consequence. They were leaning toward her with the body language of people receiving rather than giving, and she was speaking with the measured, unhurried confidence of someone who understood that the people she was talking to needed time to process what they were hearing. He watched her hands as she spoke. She had always used her hands when she talked a contained, precise gesture language that he had once found endearing and had later stopped noticing, and now watched from across a room with the specific grief of someone cataloging what they gave away. He had given away her hands, her laugh, the way she held a room by letting it find its own gravity around her, rather than asserting herself as the center. He had given all of that away and called the giving a liberation, and the word had been true, but not in the way he had meant it. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he recognized immediately. Carter Sloan, the chairman of Vance Technologies board. The text said, "Julian, I've been briefed on the SEC situation. I need you in New York first thing tomorrow. Board meeting, 9 a.m. Julian read it. Then he read it again. A board meeting called by the chairman with less than 12 hours' notice. He had been in this position before on the right side of it 3 years ago, watching a different CEO receive a similar summons and understanding what it meant. The board was not calling a meeting to strategize. The board was calling a meeting to manage a transition. He typed back, "I'll be there." He put the phone away and did not allow himself to think past that exchange, because the thinking that lay beyond it was too large to hold in a room that still had an hour left in it and people still watching. Constance Fairfax appeared at his side again. He was beginning to understand that her appearances were not accidental, that she moved through events the way experienced intelligence, people move through rooms with purpose wrapped in the appearance of drift. She said, "How are you holding up?" He looked at her. "That's a remarkable question under the circumstances," he said. She said, "It's a genuine one." He said, "I've had better evenings." She said, "Yes. I imagine this is quite a lot to absorb in one sitting." He said, "Is that what this is, an absorption exercise?" She almost smiled. "No," she said. "This is an evening that became what it was going to be regardless of your presence in it. Your being here is simply a coincidence with consequences." He said, "She didn't know I was coming." Constance said, "No. We reviewed the guest list, of course, but your name wasn't on the Foundation's list. You were added through a corporate relations channel 3 weeks ago, a reciprocal invitation through the Whitmore Group." Julian nodded slowly. The Whitmore Group. The same Whitmore who had just suspended the merger transaction. He had been invited to this room by the mechanism of his own deal, which had been connected to Serafina's network, which had known what he was building long before he understood what she had built. The interconnections had a dizzying quality when you followed them back to their source. He said, "She didn't plan tonight around me." Constance said, "Serafina doesn't plan things around people who don't factor into her objectives. She's been clear about that since the beginning." He said, "What are her objectives?" Constance regarded him with the look of someone deciding how precisely to be honest. "To build something real," she said. "To hold accountable what needs accounting. To create space for people who were hollowed out by the kind of treatment that doesn't leave bruises." She paused. "You were not the target of this evening, Julian. You were a byproduct. The work was always larger than you." That sentence, "you were a byproduct," carried a weight that his ego processed as insult before his intelligence caught up and recognized it as the worst possible thing simply true. He said, "Tell me something honestly." She said, "If I can." He said, "Does she think about what it cost her, what she had to give up to get here?" Constance was quiet for a moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that she would tell you the more interesting question is what she was able to build once the weight was lifted." He said, "That's not an answer." She said, "It's the only one I'm authorized to give you." She touched his arm briefly, not warm exactly, but human. "Call your attorney, Julian, tonight before midnight. There are decisions that will be easier to make in the next 3 hours than they will be tomorrow morning." She walked away. He watched her go and understood that the advice was genuine, and that it had come from someone who had done the arithmetic on his situation with more precision than he had, and that the window she had identified was real. He called David. David answered immediately, which told Julian his attorney had been sitting with the phone in his hand. Julian said, "What do I need to do before midnight?" David said, "Proactive cooperation request to the SEC. Filed tonight, not tomorrow. If we file it before the Chronicle story runs, it changes the posture of the inquiry from reactive to voluntary. It's a significant difference in how the situation is processed." Julian said, "Do it." David said, "Julian, if we do this, if we file voluntary cooperation tonight, it will be public record by morning. There will be no narrative management possible after that. The situation will be exactly what it is in plain language in front of everyone." Julian said, "I know." David said, "You understand what that means for the board meeting tomorrow." Julian said, "I know what it means." David said, "All right." His voice had the quality it had earlier, that involuntary relief. "All right, Julian. I'll file it in the next 90 minutes. Julian said, "Make sure it's complete. Don't qualify anything. Don't soften anything. If the documentation she submitted is accurate, match it." David was quiet. Then, "Is it accurate?" Julian said, "Yes." The single syllable cost him something. He felt it leave. David said, "Then I'll make sure we match it." He paused. "Julian, for what it's worth, this is the right call." Julian said, "I know." He hung up. He stood in the main hall and the Gala moved around him, and he thought about what David had said. This is the right call, and sat with the uncomfortable recognition that the right call was something he had been capable of all along, that it had never been beyond his reach. That every moment in the last 11 years, where he had chosen the convenient version over the true one, had been a choice made by a man with full access to better options, and that the accumulation of those choices was the complete architecture of everything that was now coming apart around him. He had not been a villain in the operatic sense. He had been something more common and more damaging, a man who had found it easier to edit the truth than to tell it, and who had chosen, when confronted with a person honest enough to be worth respecting, to call that honesty ordinary instead. He looked across the room one more time. Serafina was near the staircase now, the same staircase she had descended 2 hours ago, in a moment that had rewritten everything he thought he knew about his own story. She was saying goodbye to the ambassador, a formal, warm goodbye, the kind that contains the promise of future conversations. The ambassador took her hand in both of his and said something that made her nod with genuine feeling. Prince Alistair waited 2 steps back with the patience of someone who understands that the moments that matter take the time they take. When the ambassador moved away, Alistair stepped forward and said something quiet, and Serafina tilted her head and responded, and they stood like that close, easy. 2 people in genuine accord, and Julian watched it from across the room and felt no anger, which surprised him. What he felt was something closer to witness, the specific, late-arriving clarity of someone seeing a thing correctly for the first time. He had not ruined her. He had, by discarding her, accidentally freed her to become exactly what she was capable of being. And the version of her standing at the bottom of that staircase in the room she had built, surrounded by the world she had earned, that version could not have existed inside the life he had offered her. He had been too small a container for what she actually was. He had not known it because he had never looked hard enough to see it, but it was true. And the truth of it was the most expensive thing he had encountered in a life full of expensive truths. His phone buzzed. Carter Sloane again, this time a call, not a text. Julian answered. Carter said, "I've spoken with 3 board members in the last hour. I want to be honest with you, Julian." Julian said, "Go ahead." Carter said, "The sentiment has shifted." Julian said, "I know." Carter said, "There will need to be conversations about the path forward." That Julian said, "Carter, I know." He said it quietly and without argument, and Carter stopped mid-sentence, caught by the absence of the resistance he had been preparing for. There was a pause. Carter said, "You're prepared for tomorrow." Julian said, "I'll be there at 9. Carter said, "All right." Another pause, during which Julian could hear the particular silence of a man revising what he had expected this call to require. "Julian," Carter said, "for whatever it's worth." He didn't finish the sentence. Julian said, "I know, Carter." He hung up, Around him, guests were beginning to make their departures, the extended goodbye process of a room full of important people who understand that exits are also communications. He watched them go in pairs and small groups, each departure accompanied by the particular warmth of people who have shared something real, or at least something significant. He thought about leaving. He thought about the hotel room 3 blocks away, where he had straightened his bow tie and checked the merger update, and believed with complete sincerity that the evening ahead was going to confirm everything he deserved. He thought about Isabella, who by now was almost certainly in a car heading somewhere that made more social sense than standing beside a man whose empire was being publicly restructured. He did not blame her. She had been many things, but she had not been dishonest about what she wanted, and what she wanted had included someone whose standing was secure. His standing was no longer that. He had walked into this room as a man who believed he was untouchable, and was leaving it as a man who had just filed voluntary cooperation with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the distance between those two versions of himself was not the distance of one catastrophic evening. It was the distance of 11 years of accumulated choices, each small, each seemingly manageable, each compounding invisibly, until the weight of them became the weight of tonight. He moved toward the exit. He stopped, once turned, and looked back at the room. Serafina was still near the staircase. She was not looking at him. She was in conversation, fully present in it, giving her complete attention to the person she was speaking with, in the way that he had once received from her, and had gradually, carelessly stopped valuing. She would not watch him leave. He understood this without testing it. She had said what she intended to say to him. She had done what she had spent 3 years building toward. His departure was not a moment for her. It was simply the end of an incidental presence. He turned back toward the exit and walked, past the quietly departing guests, past the staff managing the graceful close of the evening, past the coat room where he retrieved his coat from an attendant who said, "Have a good evening, sir," and to whom he said thank you with the automatic courtesy of a man whose manners had survived the night, even when his certainty had not. He walked through the doors of the Grand Federal Palace and into the Washington night, and the air outside was cooler than he expected, and somewhere behind him, the gala continued its final chapter with or without him, which was, he understood now exactly how it had always been going to end. The car ride back to the hotel took 11 minutes. Julian counted them, not because he was tracking time, but because counting was the only cognitive task he could manage that didn't require him to look directly at the full weight of what the evening had produced. The driver said nothing. The city moved past the windows. He sat with his hands in his lap and his coat across his knees, and his phone face down on the seat beside him. And he thought about the morning this had all started, not tonight, but 3 years ago, the morning his assistant had sent that text. He thought about how easy it had been, how frictionless, how completely he had managed to end 11 years of partnership without once having to look at what he was actually discarding. That ease, he understood now, had not been a sign that he was right. It had been a sign that he had stopped seeing her entirely. You can only discard something painlessly when you have already, in every way that matters, stopped recognizing its value. The hotel room was exactly as he had left it. Isabella's things were gone, her makeup arranged on the bathroom counter that morning, her second dress hanging in the closet, the small evidence of her presence that he catalogued now only by its absence. She had sent a text at some point during his drive. He saw the notification without opening it. It could wait. Everything that was hers could wait, because none of it was what required his attention tonight. He sat on the edge of the bed and called David. David was still working. Julian could hear the specific background texture of a man at a desk in a lit office while the rest of the building slept around him. David said, "The cooperation request is filed, time-stamped 11:47 p.m. Julian said, "Good." David said, "The Chronicle's story is scheduled to run at 6 a.m. Our filing will be public by 5. Julian said, "So we're ahead of it." David said, "By 1 hour," which is not nothing. Julian said, "No, it isn't." There was a pause. David said, "The board meeting tomorrow. Julian, I want to be in the room." Julian said, "I know." David said, "Whatever happens in that room, whatever Carter has prepared, I need you to let me handle the legal framing. Don't speak to the substance of the SEC matter without me present." Julian said, "Understood." David said, "Get some sleep." Julian said, "I'll try." He put the phone down and did not try. He lay on top of the covers in his clothes and looked at the ceiling and let the night process itself through him. All of it. The staircase, Serafina's face, the merger dissolving investor by investor like a structure in water. Constance's voice saying, "You were a byproduct." Carter's unfinished sentence. The Financial Chronicle's 6 a.m. headline that was already written and already true and already irreversible. He let all of it arrive without managing it, which was a new experience, and it was terrible and clarifying in equal measure. He slept for 3 hours, woke at 4:15 to 3 missed calls from Marcus, 1 from Carter, and a text from Isabella that said, "I think we both know this was already ending. I'm sorry it ended like this." He read it twice. It was, he thought, the most honest thing she had said to him in 8 months, and he was grateful for it, in the way you are grateful for honesty when it arrives too late to change anything, but just in time to close something cleanly. He typed back, "Take care of yourself." He meant it. He put the phone on the nightstand and showered and dressed and ordered coffee from room service and sat at the small desk with his coffee and waited for 5 a.m. At 5:03, his phone lit up with a news alert. Vance Technologies CEO files, voluntary SEC, cooperation in advance of inquiry. He read the headline, read the subhead, read the first paragraph, which was accurate, which was sourced to public filings which contained no spin, because there was no spin available when the document itself was plain language. He set the phone down and drank his coffee. At 5:47, the second alert came. Financial Chronicle exclusive. The architect behind Vance Technologies. How Serafina Hayes built an empire and then built her own. He did not read that article immediately. He understood what it contained. He would read it, but not yet. He finished his coffee and called a car and went to the airport and boarded the 6:30 shuttle to New York, because whatever came next was going to come in a boardroom, and he was going to be in that boardroom on time and prepared and as honest as the damage he had done would allow him to be. The Vance Technologies boardroom was on the 42nd floor of a building in Midtown that Julian had chosen 11 years ago, partly because the view made him feel like the city was something he could hold in his hand. He had stood at that window hundreds of times. He stood at it now, 20 minutes before the meeting, holding nothing. Carter arrived 8 minutes before 9. He greeted Julian with the measured warmth of a man who respects someone he is about to have a very difficult conversation, with which is its own kind of courtesy. He said, "I read the Chronicle piece this morning." Julian said, "So did I." He had read it in the car from the airport, all of it, every paragraph, including the section that documented the 2019 board intervention with a precision that could only have come from primary sources, and the section that quoted 3 former Vance Technologies employees who had apparently been waiting for someone to ask them the right questions. The article was not cruel. It was simply thorough. Serafina had not given the Chronicle a story about Julian. She had given them a story about herself, about what she had built, and how and why, and Julian appeared in it only as context, as the condition she had been working within and then working free of. He was 3 paragraphs. She was the whole thing. Carter said, "The board is prepared to move constructively." Julian said, "I know what that means, Carter." Carter looked at him for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I suppose you do." The other board members arrived in the next 12 minutes. David arrived at 8:58 and took a seat to Julian's right and opened a leather folder and said nothing, because David had the professional discipline to understand when presence was the message. The meeting began. Carter spoke first, as he always did, and the language he used was the careful, formal language of institutional transition words like strategic recalibration and leadership continuity, and the long-term interests of stakeholders, and under all of it was the simple, unambiguous fact that the board had lost confidence in Julian's position. Not in the explosive, accusatory way of a crisis boardroom, in the quiet, decisive way of people who have done the arithmetic and reached a conclusion that they are too professional to dress up as anything other than what it is. Julian had been in enough of these rooms to know when a decision had already been made before the meeting started. He said, "I'd like to speak before we move to a formal vote." Carter said, "Of course." Julian looked around the table. 12 faces. People he had worked with for years, some of whom he had hired, some of whom had hired him, all of whom had built their professional investment in Vance Technologies on a foundation that had turned out to be more complicated than any of them had publicly known. He said, "The documentation submitted to the SEC is accurate. I'm not going to ask this board to defend a narrative that doesn't hold. The cooperation filing we submitted last night is the beginning of a full accounting, and I intend to cooperate completely with that process." He paused. "I also intend to resign my position as CEO effective immediately so that this company can move through what comes next without the complication of my continued presence at its head." The room was quiet. Carter said, Julian said, "This is not a negotiating position, it's a decision." He looked at David, who gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. Julian said, "I'd like the transition to be clean. I'd like the board to have everything it needs from me to manage that process. And I'd like it on the record that the contributions of Serafina Hayes to this company's survival and growth were real, were significant, and were systematically uncredited. That is not a legal concession. It is simply true, and it should be in the record." Another silence longer. Then one of the board members, Eleanor Park, whom Julian had recruited 5 years ago, and who had always had the particular quality of saying the difficult thing without cruelty, said, "Thank you, Julian." "Just that." He nodded. Carter began the procedural elements of the resignation, and David managed the legal framework, and Julian sat through it all with the specific stillness of a man who has made a decision he cannot reverse, and has found on the other side of making it something that feels uncomfortably like relief. It was over by 10:45. He rode the elevator down from the 42nd floor alone, watching the numbers descend, and thought about what the view from that window had felt like the first time he stood at it, the city below enormous and indifferent and full of possibility, and the particular feeling of a man who believed he was going to make it matter. He had been right about one thing, he thought. He had made it matter, just not in the way he had imagined, and not through the mechanisms he had claimed. He stepped out of the elevator into the lobby and walked through it and out into the midtown morning and stood on the sidewalk and breathed the city air and understood that he was for the first time in over a decade not the CEO of anything. He did not know yet what that made him, but he understood standing there that the question was finally the right one. The Financial Chronicle story ran for 3 days on the site's most read list. By the end of the first day, it had been picked up by 14 other outlets. By the end of the second, it was in the international press, London, Paris, Frankfurt, and 3 Asian financial publications, each of which added local context about the Phoenix Foundation's Atlantic Corridor relationships. By the third day, it had generated a category of coverage that Julian had seen applied to other people and had never once imagined would be applied to the history of his marriage. It was being called a story about invisible labor, about the systematic erasure of women's professional contributions from the narratives of the companies they helped build, about the specific violence of being indispensable and uncredited. He read the coverage from his apartment in New York, where he was living quietly while David managed the SEC cooperation process, and he did not attempt to respond to any of it. David had advised silence, and Julian had agreed to silence. And more importantly, Julian had understood that silence was the only honest posture available to him, that anything he said in response to accurate coverage of true events was by definition an attempt to manage a truth he had already conceded. The SEC inquiry took 4 months. It was thorough. The cooperation filing had set the tone, and the process moved with the methodical precision of an institution that has been handed a well-organized archive by someone who understood documentation as a form of communication. Julian participated fully, as he had committed to, and David managed the legal mechanics with the expertise of a man who knew the difference between accountability and destruction and worked steadily to ensure that Julian's cooperation remained clearly in the former category. The outcome was a formal finding of material misrepresentation in several public disclosures made between 2019 and 2022, a significant financial penalty, and a 5-year bar from serving as CEO of a publicly traded company. His attorneys had argued successfully against criminal referral on the basis of the voluntary cooperation and the absence of personal enrichment beyond standard executive compensation. David called Julian when the final settlement was confirmed and said, "It could have been worse." Julian said, "I know." David said, "It also could have been avoided." Julian said, "I know that too." There was a pause. David said, "What are you going to do?" Julian said, "I don't know yet." David said, "That might be the most honest thing you've said in years." Julian almost smiled. "It might be," he said. Serafina heard about the SEC settlement through Constance, who sent her a text that said simply, "Finalized today, as expected." She was in her Georgetown office when the message arrived, sitting across from a woman named Patricia Owens, who had come to the Phoenix Foundation 3 months earlier through their referral network, 58 years old, former operations director of a mid-sized pharmaceutical company, who had spent 14 years building systems that her CEO had publicly credited to a male colleague while she watched from a meeting room chair and said nothing because she needed the income and had 2 children in college, and understood that the cost of speaking was one she couldn't afford at the time. She had come to the foundation after seeing the Chronicle story, had sent an email that began with the words, "I don't know if this is the right place, but I didn't know where else to go." Serafina had read that email personally and had responded within the hour. Patricia was sitting across from her now 6 weeks into a process that was part legal consultation, part career rebuilding, part the specific unhurried work of helping someone remember that what they knew about themselves before someone spent 14 years editing, it was still true. Serafina read Constance's text, set the phone face down, and returned her full attention to Patricia. The settlement could wait. This couldn't. After the meeting, she stood at her office window for a few minutes and allowed herself to feel the full quiet of what had been completed. Not satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction implied she had wanted something from Julian that she had now received and that had never been accurate. What she felt was closer to closure, which is different from satisfaction, the way finishing a long book is different from winning an argument. The story had reached its end. The accounting was done. The truth was in the public record, and the institutional record and the personal record of everyone who had been affected by the distance between what was true and what had been claimed, and that record was now accurate, and that accuracy was permanent. She had not set out to destroy Julian Vance. She had set out to tell the truth in the right place at the right time with the right documentation, and she had waited until she was certain that the telling was about something larger than the two of them before she had done it. That had been the discipline. That had been the thing that separated what she had done from what it might otherwise have looked like. She had held the evidence for 3 years and built a foundation first, so that when the truth finally arrived where it belonged, it arrived in the context of something constructive, something that pointed forward, something that answered the implicit question and then what before the question was asked. The Phoenix Foundation's first full year of operations exceeded every metric Serafina and Constance had set. They had expected to support 40 individuals through their direct services program in year 1. They supported 112. They had projected 3 institutional partnerships. They formalized 9, including 2 with European government-affiliated organizations that had come directly from Prince Alistair's endorsement. The Foundation's public launch at the Grand Sapphire Gala had generated a volume of attention that neither of them had fully anticipated, not because the event had been dramatic, though it had been, but because the story it told had resonance. There were a great many people, it turned out, who understood from personal experience what it meant to build something in silence and watch someone else receive credit for the architecture. The Chronicle story had given that experience a specific, documented case study. The Foundation gave it a place to go. Margot Chen called in the spring, 8 months after the gala. She said, "I have something I want to run by you." Serafina said, "Go ahead." Margot said, "Julian's attorney reached out to me last week. Julian is asking not through formal channels, but asking whether you would be willing to have a direct conversation. Not legal, not about the settlement, just a conversation." Serafina was quiet for a moment. Margot said, "I told them I would pass it along without recommendation. I genuinely don't know what the right answer is here." Serafina said, "I'll think about it." She thought about it for 6 days. On the 7th day, she called Margot and said, Tell him yes. One conversation, no agenda, no attorneys in the room. Margot said, "Are you sure?" Serafina said, "I'm sure." They met on a Thursday afternoon in a small conference room in a building neither of them had a history with neutral ground, chosen with the deliberateness of two people who understood that the space a conversation happens in shapes the conversation. Julian arrived first. When Serafina walked in, he stood immediately without thinking, the instinct of a man confronting a situation he has no practiced behavior for. She sat down across from him and looked at him directly and waited. He said, "Thank you for coming." She said, "You asked, I came." He said, "I've been trying to figure out what I want to say to you." She said, "Take your time." He said, "I read the Chronicle piece, all of it. I read the follow-up coverage. I read what people said in the comments, the ones who recognized their own situation in yours." He paused. "I didn't know it was that common," he said. "What happened to you? I didn't understand how many people it had happened to." She looked at him. "That's why the foundation exists," she said. He said, I know that now." He looked at his hands. "I want to say something, and I want to say it without expecting anything from you in response. Can I do that?" She said, "Yes." He said, "What I did, not just the divorce, not just the way I handled it, but 11 years of editing you out of your own contributions, taking what you built and wearing it as mine. That wasn't a mistake of attention. It was a choice. I made it every time I had the alternative of acknowledging you and didn't. And I made it enough times that I convinced myself it wasn't a choice at all, that it was just how things were. But it was a choice. And I'm sorry. Not for what it cost me, for what it cost you." He said it the way he had said it at the Gala, without architecture, without the rhetorical management that had shaped most of his public communications for 20 years. Just the words, stripped. She sat with them for a moment. Then she said, "I know you are." He said, "Is that enough?" She said, "It's not about enough, Julian. It's not a transaction. You don't get something from me in exchange for the apology. That's not how this works." He said, "I know." She said, "What I can tell you is that I don't carry this anymore. What happened between us, it shaped a lot of what I built, but it doesn't live in me the way it used to. I set it down a while ago." "Maud," he said, "when?" She thought about it. "Somewhere around the first time one of our foundation clients told me that something we had built had helped them," she said. "I realized I had finished needing the old story to be different, because the new one was better." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You were always going to be this." She said, "I needed room to become it." He said, "I know." The conversation lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, they shook hands, not warmly, not coldly, but with the specific human acknowledgement of two people who shared something real for a long time and have arrived finally at a place where the accounting is done and nothing more is owed in either direction. She walked out first. He watched her go, as he had at the Gala, and this time the feeling that moved through him was not grief and not jealousy and not the particular ache of irreversible loss. It was something quieter, something that might, if he were being honest, be called the beginning of respect for the truth, arrived at too late to change anything, but arrived at genuinely, which was perhaps the only kind of arrival still available to him. 6 months later, Julian was living in a smaller apartment managing a financial penalty that had restructured his personal holdings significantly and working quietly without press as an unpaid advisor to a corporate governance nonprofit focused on attribution practices in executive leadership. He had not sought media coverage. He had not written an essay about his experience or given an interview framing his cooperation as heroic. He had done the work because it was the work that was in front of him, and because doing it without seeking credit was the only way it meant anything. It was he understood the slowest possible education in the lesson that Serafina had tried to teach him simply by existing beside him for 11 years. He was learning it the way people learn things they should have understood earlier, with the particular patience of someone who has no other option. The Phoenix Foundation launched its second annual gathering in Washington, 14 months after the Grand Sapphire Gala. The invitation list had grown. The programming had deepened. 3 new country partnerships had been formalized. Serafina sat at the head of the table in the Foundation's Georgetown conference room on the morning of the event and looked around at the team she had assembled, young and experienced, careful and bold. People who understood that the work they were doing mattered in ways that were difficult to quantify and impossible to abandon. Constance was to her left, as she always was. Prince Alistair's office had confirmed his attendance that morning. Margot's firm was handling 2 new legal partnership agreements. Everything was in motion, as it always was, as it would always be, not because the work was finished, but because the work by its nature was never finished. There would always be more people who needed what the Foundation offered, more Patricias who had spent 14 years watching their architecture credited to someone else, more mornings when the right thing was to get up and keep building, and so that was what she would do. She looked down at the letter on the desk in front of her, the one she had written the previous evening, and had decided after some thought to keep. Not to send. To keep as a record of her own clarity. She read the last 4 lines of it one more time quietly to herself. You said I was nothing without you. I hope what followed teaches you the difference between money and value. Character is the only currency that compounds, and I have spent 3 years investing in nothing else. She folded the letter, put it in the drawer, closed it. Then she looked up at the room, at the people, at the work, at the day that was already beginning, and she was ready. She had not been destroyed by what he did to her. She had been defined by what she chose to do next. And what she chose to do next had become in ways that exceeded every plan she had made and every outcome she had imagined, something that mattered deeply, durably, in the lives of real people, in real rooms, in a real world that was better for the work she had done in it. She had walked out of a penthouse with 1 suitcase and a silence that frightened even the doorman, and she had turned that silence into the most articulate statement of her life. Julian Vance had called her nothing. She had made that the starting line, and she had never, not for a single step of what followed, looked back. The morning of the second gathering, Serafina arrived at the Georgetown office before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops, and she let herself in through the side entrance the way she always did, because the front of the building belonged to the world, and the side of it still belonged to her. The conference room she had sat in the night before, where she had written the letter she decided to keep, was empty now, and washed in the pale gray light that comes before a day has decided what kind of day it intends to be. She set her bag on the table. She looked at the room, and for a moment, just one, she allowed herself to stand in the full strangeness of how far the distance was between this room and the granite countertop, where 3.5 years earlier she had read a text message typed by someone else and set her phone face down and decided not to break. That decision, she understood now, had not been a single act. It had been a discipline she had to renew every morning for years in rooms exactly like this one before anyone else arrived. The world believed that strength was a thing you had or didn't have, a quality you were issued at birth, like the color of your eyes. Serafina knew better. Strength was a practice. It was the thing you did before the day got loud, the quiet act of choosing again who you were going to be in it. She had practiced it long enough now that it had stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like architecture load-bearing, permanent, invisible to anyone who hadn't watched her build it. Constance arrived at 7, as she always did, with 2 coffees and the particular expression of a woman who has read the morning briefings and found them satisfactory. She set 1 coffee in front of Serafina and said, Berlin confirmed overnight. The Bundestag Working Group wants the attribution framework on their autumn agenda. They're calling it the Hayes Standard in the draft language. Serafina took the coffee. That won't survive committee, she said. They'll rename it something procedural. Constance almost smiled. They tried, she said. 3 of the women on the working group put it back. Apparently there was a conversation about whether the people who do the work should be the ones whose names survive the work, and apparently it was a short conversation. Serafina looked at her coffee for a moment. Then she said, Good. It was the only word she trusted herself to say, because the larger thing, the fact that a standard built out of her own erasure was about to be written with her name on it into the law of a country that had never heard of her 4 years ago, was too large to hold steadily this early in the morning, and she had a gathering to run. The second annual gathering of the Phoenix Foundation was not a gala. Constance had been clear about that from the beginning, and Serafina had agreed completely. The gala had been the announcement, the single perfect note struck once to make the world turn its head, and you could not strike that note twice without it becoming a performance of itself. The gathering was something else. It was the work made visible. It was 300 people in a converted hall near the Capitol. Not heads of state this time, or not only, but the actual population of what the foundation had become. The clients who had become advocates, the advocates who had become staff, the staff who had become architects of programs that now ran in 9 countries, the institutional partners who had stopped treating attribution as a courtesy and started treating it as a standard and a scattering of the quiet, consequential people who funded all of it and asked for nothing in return except the assurance that the thing they were funding was real. Patricia Owens opened the gathering. Serafina had asked her to 3 months earlier in the same Georgetown office, where Patricia had first sat down across from her with the careful, braced posture of a woman who had spent 14 years being told the systems she built belonged to someone else. Patricia had said, when Serafina asked her, "I'm not a speaker." Serafina had said, "Neither was I. I was the person who wrote the speeches other people delivered. We are exactly the same kind of person, Patricia, which is why I'm asking you and not someone who finds this easy." Patricia had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "What do I talk about?" And Serafina had said, "The truth, in the right room. You'll find you've been preparing for it your whole life." Patricia stood at the front of the hall now in a navy suit she had chosen herself, and she did not have notes, and she spoke for 11 minutes about what it does to a person to be indispensable and uncredited, about the specific erosion of being the one who knows how everything works, while watching someone else accept the recognition for it, about the way that arrangement teaches you slowly, and without your noticing, to disappear from your own life. She did not perform pain. She simply described a structure accurately from the inside, the way an engineer describes a building she helped design, and the 300 people in the hall listened with the full-body attention of people who recognized the architecture because they had lived in it too. When she finished, she said, "I spent 14 years believing the work was the only part of me that mattered and that the work belonged to someone else. The Phoenix Foundation did not give me my work back. It gave me back the part of me that the work had been hiding, the part that knew the whole time what I was actually worth. I'm here because someone read an email I almost didn't send. And I'm telling you this in case you're holding an email you almost don't send. Send it." She stepped back from the podium, and the hall came to its feet, and Patricia Owens, 58, restored. Standing in front of a room that saw her completely, looked across the crowd to where Serafina was sitting, and found her and the 2 women held each other's gaze for a moment that contained the entire architecture of the thing they had built together, and neither of them looked away first. Serafina did not speak until near the end of the gathering. When she did, she kept it short. She had learned long ago that the most powerful thing a person in her position could do was leave room that the gathering belonged to the people in it, not to the woman whose name was on the building, and that the deepest form of leadership was the discipline of taking up less space than you were entitled to, so that others could finally take up the space they had been denied. She thanked the partners. She named the 9 countries. She announced without ceremony that the foundation would open its first chapter outside the Atlantic corridor in the coming year, in a region where the particular violence of uncredited labor took forms the foundation was only beginning to understand and intended to learn. And then she said the thing she had decided that morning in the gray light that she would say. 4 years ago, she said, I was told I was nothing. I was told it across a table by a person who believed it in a moment when I had no evidence to offer to the contrary, except the evidence I carried inside myself, which is the only evidence that ever actually matters, and the only evidence the world will never accept on its own. So I did what people like us do. I went and built the proof. Not for him. He was never the audience. The proof was for me, and then it was for you. And now it belongs to everyone who walks into a room and is asked to disappear inside it. You are not furniture. You were never furniture. And the next time someone tries to convince you otherwise, I want you to remember that there is now an entire institution in 9 countries built on the single proposition that they are wrong. We are the proof. All of us. Together. Thank you for being it with me. She stepped back. The hall rose, and Serafina Hayes stood in the noise of 300 people who understood exactly what she meant, and she let it move through her without managing it, because she had finally, after a lifetime of standing behind other people's ovations, learned how to stand inside her own. Prince Alistair of Valoria had flown in for the gathering as his office had confirmed, and he had sat in the third row through all of it, with the stillness of a man who understood that his presence was a form of endorsement, and that the most respectful thing he could do with it was to make it quiet. He had not sat at the front. He had not been introduced. He had come simply because the work mattered to him, and because the woman who built it mattered to him. And he had learned over 3 years of knowing her that she valued the second thing being expressed through the first. They had dinner afterward, the two of them, at a small restaurant near the river that Alistair had chosen, because it was the kind of place where consequential people went specifically to be left alone, and the staff had the particular trained indifference that the truly private require. They had been having dinners like this for 2 years. Serafina had been clear with herself about what they were, and were not with the same discipline she applied to everything. They were a partnership of regard, two people of substance, who found each other irreplaceably interesting, and she had been careful, relentlessly, deliberately careful not to let it become a thing she needed. She had spent 11 years needing a man building her life around his survival, pouring herself into his ascent until there was nothing of her left that hadn't been spent on him. She had promised herself on a sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan on a gray October afternoon that she would never again organize her existence around another person's gravity, and she had kept that promise for 3 years with a rigor that had cost her something she rarely let herself name. So when Alistair set down his glass that evening and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it badly, which is unusual for me," Serafina felt the discipline rise in her like a reflex, the old guarding instinct, the readiness to manage whatever came next so that it could not manage her. She said, "Ask it." Alistair looked at her for a moment with the genuine regard that had drawn her to him in the first place, the attention of someone who finds the person across from him worth his complete presence. He said, "I have spent 2 years watching you build something out of the worst thing that ever happened to you, and I have spent 2 years certain of one fact above all others, which is that you do not need me. You have made yourself deliberately into a person who needs no one. I understand why. I have never once asked you to become someone who needs me, and I never will." He paused. "But I have come to a place," he said, "where I would very much like to spend the rest of my life standing beside someone who doesn't need me and chooses me anyway, because that the choosing with no need underneath it seems to me the only version of this worth having. And I can't think of a single person on earth I would rather build the rest of my life beside than the one who taught me what the word partnership actually means." Serafina was quiet for a long time. Long enough that a lesser man would have started filling the silence, and Alistair, who was not a lesser man, did not. He simply waited with the stillness of someone who understood that the silence belonged to her, and that the most respectful thing he could do was let her have all of it she required. When she finally spoke, she did not answer the question directly. She said, "Do you know what he told me at the end?" Alistair shook his head. "He told me I was never the kind of woman men build monuments to." She turned her glass slowly on the table. "And the thing is, he was right in a way he didn't intend. I'm not. I never wanted to be a monument. A monument is a thing you build to a person and then stop seeing. I spent 11 years being a monument, admired occasionally, and looked at. Never. I don't want to be built to. I want to be built with." She looked up at him. "If you are asking me to be your duchess so that you can put me somewhere beautiful and stop seeing me, the answer is no, and it will always be no, and you should leave now, and we will both pretend this was a lovely dinner." Alistair held her gaze. "I am asking you," he said, "to build the rest of it with me, as equals. Two people who are each separately complete, and who have decided that complete is better with company. I have no interest in a monument, Serafina. I have spent 2 years falling in love with the architect. and Serafina Hayes, who had walked out of a penthouse with one suitcase, and a silence that frightened the doorman, who had rebuilt herself stone by stone in a city of quiet power, who had made an entire institution out of the proposition that she was not nothing. Serafina Hayes looked across a small table at a man who had said the only words that could have reached her, and she felt the old guarding discipline loosen, not break, but loosen. The way a door you have held shut for years finally opens, because you have finally decided freely, with no need underneath the decision that you want to walk through it. Yes, she said. On those terms, yes. They told no one for a month. It was not secrecy, so much as ownership, the determination of two private people to hold the beginning of a thing entirely between themselves before the world got its hands on it. When they did tell people, they told them in person, one at a time, in the order of how much each person had earned the telling. They told Constance first. Constance listened, set down her pen, and said, "Well, I did wonder how long it would take." Which was. Serafina noted exactly what Constance had said the first time she had called her 4 years ago, and the symmetry of it, the same words at the beginning of the rebuilding, and at this new beginning that the rebuilding had made possible, was not lost on either of them. Constance stood, came around the desk, and embraced her, which Constance had done exactly twice in 4 years, and Serafina understood the weight of it. "You built the whole thing first," Constance said into her ear. "You made yourself someone who needs no one, and then you let yourself want something. That's the only order that doesn't cost you everything. Most people do it backward. You did it right." She stepped back. "I'm proud of you," she said. "I don't say that often. I mean it precisely." They told Margot next. Margot Chen, who had walked into a negotiation 4 years ago with a 4-inch binder and the words were going to need a larger room, listened to the news and was quiet for a moment, and then said, "I'm going to want to look at the prenuptial framework." Serafina laughed the real laugh and said, "I would be disappointed if you didn't." Margot did not smile because Margot rarely smiled, but something in her face changed, and she said, "When I met you, you were the most contained person I had ever sat across a table from. You had built a wall so complete I couldn't see where the bricks met. I have spent 4 years watching you decide very slowly which parts of that wall you actually still needed. This is the last brick coming down, isn't it?" It was not a question. Serafina said yes. Margot nodded once. "Good," she said. "It was a magnificent wall, but walls are for during. You're allowed to be in the after now." And Patricia Owens, when she heard, said only, "Does he see you?" And when Serafina said yes, Patricia said, "Then I'm glad. That's the only thing that was ever missing. Not for the rest of us. We saw you. For you." Which undid something in Serafina that had been knotted so long she had forgotten it was a knot. And the two women sat together in the Georgetown office and did not need to say anything else. The wedding was small, and it was held in Valoria in the early autumn in a stone chapel that had stood for 400 years and had seen presumably a great many marriages of state and convenience and dynasty, and this one which was none of those things. Serafina wore no white. She wore a deep sapphire, the color of the Gala, the color of the gown that had turned a room of presidents toward her, like sunflowers finding the light, because she had decided that the sapphire belonged to her, now that it was the color of the self she had built, and not the color of any man's claim on her, and she intended to be married in the proof of who she was. There were 40 people. Constance stood beside her. Margot sat in the second row with the leather folder she took everywhere closed for once in her lap. Patricia Owens flew in with her 2 grown children, the ones she had stayed silent for 14 years to put through college, and they sat together, and Patricia held both their hands. The foundation was there, not the institution, but the people, the specific human beings the institution had been built to serve and had become, the advocates and the architects, and the ones who had sent the email they almost didn't send. They were her family now. Serafina understood looking out at them. Not by blood and not by law, but by the deeper thing, the thing that had carried her through the years when she had nothing, the recognition between people who have been told they are nothing and have decided together methodically to prove the precise opposite. Alistair's family received her with a warmth that was not ceremony. His mother, the dowager, an old woman with the unhurried authority of someone who had outlived everyone who had ever tried to manage her, took Seraphina's hands before the ceremony and said in lightly accented English, "My son has met a great many people who wanted to be a duchess. You are the first he has ever met who did not. That is why I gave my blessing before he asked for it." She patted Seraphina's hand. "The title is the smallest thing you bring to this family," she said. "Do not let anyone, including my son, ever tell you otherwise." When the vows came, Alistair spoke first, and he kept them plain, the same plainness she had taught him to recognize, as the only honest register the words stripped of the rhetorical architecture that power teaches people to hide behind. And when it was Seraphina's turn, she said the thing she had decided she would say, looking at him in front of the 40 people who were the entire population of who she had become. "I spent 11 years," she said, "building a life around someone who could not see me, and I learned too late that being unseen is its own kind of death, quiet and slow and easy to mistake for peace. Then I spent 3 years building a life around no one but myself, and I learned that I was in fact enough, that I had been enough the whole time, and that the only thing the world had ever taken from me was my permission to believe it. I am here today not because I need you. I built myself with great deliberateness into a person who needs no one, and I will not pretend otherwise even now, even here. I am here because I have looked at the whole of you completely the way I always wished to be looked at, and I have chosen you freely with nothing underneath the choosing but the choosing itself. That is the only gift I have that is worth giving. It cost me everything to be able to give it. And I give it to you today with both hands." There is a temptation in stories like this one to leave the man who started it all in the wreckage where he belongs, to let the cruelty be the last thing the audience remembers about him, because cruelty is satisfying to punish, and the punishment is satisfying to watch. But the truth of what happened to Julian Vance was quieter than that, and the quiet was in the end the most honest possible ending for him. He did not attend the wedding, he was not invited, and he had not expected to be, and the absence of expectation was itself a measure of how far he had traveled from the man who had once believed every room reorganized around his arrival. He heard about it the way he heard about most things now at a distance through the ordinary channels, a small item in the financial press noting that the founder of the Phoenix Foundation had married into the Valorian royal family in a private ceremony. He read it in the smaller apartment he now lived in on a Tuesday, and he sat with it for a while, and the feeling that moved through him was not grief and not jealousy, and not the old ache of irreversible loss. It was something he had been slowly learning to recognize over the preceding 2 years in the unpaid work he did for the governance nonprofit, in the long, quiet education that had no audience and offered no credit, and was therefore finally real. It was a kind of gladness distant, uncomplicated, and entirely free of any claim. He was glad she had it. He had spent 11 years failing to give her the one thing she had ever actually wanted, which was to be seen, and now someone was giving it to her, and the right response, the only response that meant anything, was to be glad and to ask for nothing, and to return to the work in front of him. He sent no message. He had learned that much. There are gestures that are about the person you make them to, and gestures that are secretly about yourself. And he had spent a lifetime confusing the two, and the slow education of the after had taught him at last to tell them apart. The most respectful thing he could offer her was his silence, not the silence of absence, the way he had once erased her, but the silence of a man who finally understood that her life was no longer a place where his presence was owed or wanted, and that honoring that was the only amends still available to him. He did that evening take out the single thing he had kept, not the divorce papers, not the SEC settlement, not any of the documents of his unmaking, but a photograph from the very beginning. San Francisco, the conference where they had met, the two of them at a bar where he had told a stranger he was 6 months from public humiliation, and she had told him to stop picking fights with journalists. They were both laughing in it. He had been laughing because she had made him, and he had not understood for 11 years that this was the rarest thing she gave anyone, and that he had stopped trying to earn it long before he stopped deserving it. He looked at the photograph for a while. Then he put it away, and he sat at his small desk, and he opened the file for the attribution case he was working on without pay or recognition, and he went back to the work which was, he understood now, the slowest possible way to learn the lesson she had been teaching him simply by existing beside him for 11 years, and the only way still left to him to learn it at all. The Phoenix Foundation in the years that followed became the thing Serafina had seen in the gray light of a Georgetown morning before anyone else arrived. Not a moment, not a gala, not a story that the press ran for 3 days and then forgot, but an institution durable and self-sustaining and larger now than any single person who had built it. The Hays Standard became law in 4 countries and practice in dozens more. The attribution framework that had begun as one woman's forensic documentation of her own erasure became the model that companies used, and then the model that companies were required to use, and eventually, the kind of thing that young people entering the workforce simply assumed had always been true, which is the final and highest form a reform can take when the world it created becomes so ordinary that no one remembers it was ever fought for. Serafina considered that, when she thought about it at all, to be the truest measure of success, not that her name survived, but that the thing she built outlived the memory of why it had been necessary. She ran the foundation for another 12 years. She brought Patricia onto the board and then made her vice chair, and then watched her become the kind of leader that other women drove across countries to sit across a table from, and the symmetry of that, the woman who had spent 14 years uncredited, becoming the one who restored credit to others, was the kind of thing Serafina no longer needed to point out to anyone, because the people in the rooms that mattered could see it for themselves. She and Alistair built the rest of their lives the way they had promised as equals, 2 complete people who had decided that complete was better with company. She kept the sapphire. She kept the letter 2 in the same drawer she had first put it in, the one that said character is the only currency that compounds, and she read it once a year, not out of bitterness, which had left her so long ago she could barely remember its shape, but as a record of the precise morning she had decided who she was going to become. And on the morning she finally stepped down, decades after a text message typed by someone else had told her to vacate the only life she had known. By 5 o'clock she stood once more at the window of the Georgetown office in the gray light before anyone else arrived, and she thought about the doorman, the one who had held the door for her the night she walked out into the rain with one suitcase and a silence so complete it had frightened him. She had never learned his name. But she thought about him sometimes, because he had been the last person to witness who she was before she became who she chose to be, and she wished in a quiet and uncomplicated way that she could find him and tell him that the silence he had been frightened of had not been the silence of a woman breaking. It had been the silence of a woman deciding. It had been the most articulate statement of her life, and it had taken her years to say it, and she had said it not with words, but with everything she built in the place where the words would have been. If you have ever been told you were nothing by someone whose opinion you were taught to need, in a moment when you had no proof to offer, but the proof you carried inside yourself, then understand this, the way Serafina Hays came to understand it on a gray morning in a room she built. The people who call you nothing are not describing you. They are describing the limit of what they were ever able to see. Your worth was never theirs to grant, which means it was never theirs to revoke. The only question that was ever yours to answer was the one she answered 60 seconds after reading a message that should have ended her, the only question that is ever actually yours to answer at all. Not what have they made of me, but what will I make of this? She walked out of a penthouse with one suitcase and a silence that frightened even the doorman. And she turned that silence into a life and an institution and a marriage of equals and a standard written into the law of nations and a long line of people who would never be told they were furniture in their own homes because of the work she chose to do in the place where her grief should have been. Julian Vance had called her nothing. She had made that the starting line. And she crossed the finish when she finally crossed it full and seen and entirely herself, not the way the world expected a wronged woman to cross it. In triumph, held up against the one who wronged her, but in the quiet, complete, unhurried way of someone who had stopped needing the old story to be different a very long time ago, because the new one was so much better, and she had built every stone of it herself.